Why did the laughter stop the moment she stepped off the bus? The Mojave dust didn't care who you were. It coated everything evenly, the razor wire, the hangars, the boots of Marines who had trained here for years. And it coated her too. The woman who arrived without rank, without escort, without explanation. A worn duffel over one shoulder, plain clothes, a quiet posture that made her easy to overlook until you noticed the scars. They were impossible to miss once seen. Pale, silvered, crisscrossing her forearms like a map drawn by violence instead of ink. One thin line cut through her eyebrow, lending her expression a permanent calm that unsettled people without them knowing why. Two Marines at the gate leaned closer as she approached. "Looks like a bad accident," one muttered. "Or a worse life," the other replied, laughing softly. She heard them, of course she did. She always heard everything, but she didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't hurry. She handed over her papers with steady hands. "Our advance. Civilian consultant." That was all the badge said. Nothing about the weight she carried. Nothing about the nights she still didn't sleep through. Nothing about how hard it was to walk back onto a military base after believing, for years, that she never would again. The guard waved her through, already forgetting her. As she walked deeper into the base, the looks followed, curious, dismissive, some amused, some uncomfortable. Marines were used to damage, but only when it fit the uniform. Her scars didn't. She felt it anyway, that familiar tightening in her chest, the old reflex to shrink, to disappear, to become smaller than the space she occupied. She didn't let it win. Colonel Madsen didn't bother hiding his skepticism. He studied her thin file like it was an administrative error someone else had failed to correct. His eyes lingered on her arms for half a second too long before returning to the paper. "Your background is vague," he said. "Systems integration doesn't usually require field presence." "Diagnostics," she replied quietly. "Failure analysis." He frowned. He'd expected nerves, over-explaining. Instead, he got restraint. "Fine," he said finally. "Observe VMX-1. Stay out of the way." Out of the way. The phrase landed heavier than he intended, or maybe exactly as intended. The hangar was loud, young, overconfident, machines whining, boots clanging, voices echoing. She was given a desk in the corner, not quite hidden, not quite included. They called her Scarface when they thought she couldn't hear. She never corrected them. She watched instead. She watched the way they treated the drones like disposable things, how they rushed fixes, how they trusted interfaces more than understanding. She noticed patterns no one else did because no one else had learned what failure really cost. Sometimes, when the hangar quieted, she walked to the far corner. The grounded drone. Old, patched, forgotten. The ghost, they called it, a joke, a write-off. She rested her hand against its cold fuselage sometimes. Not sentiment, recognition. Corporal Diaz noticed. "You see something we do?" he asked once. She paused. "Everything leaves marks," she said. "Machines too." He didn't fully understand, but he felt it mattered. The pressure came days later. A general was visiting, a live-fire exercise, careers on the line. She felt it in the air before alarms sounded. That tightening again, the warning she had learned to trust long before code or sensors. Then the screens went dark. Panic erupted, voices overlapped, commands failed, systems collapsed in seconds. She saw the contagion 12 seconds before anyone else. She stood. When she said, "I can fix it," no one believed her, not at first. But belief didn't matter. Her hands moved with a certainty born of repetition under fire. She didn't fight the system. She understood it. She isolated the threat, trapped it, redirected pathways no one else even remembered existed. 3 minutes later, the feeds returned. The silence afterward was louder than the alarms. They stared at her differently now, not impressed, unsettled. When the second attack came, electronic warfare this time, no one questioned her. "Bring the ghost online," she said. They hesitated, she didn't. The old drone rose into the sky like something resurrected, analog, shielded, unkillable in a way modern systems had forgotten how to be. They won the exercise because of it. But the moment that mattered came after. The general descended the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed on her arms, on the scars, on the small raven feather tattoo half hidden near her wrist. He froze, not in fear, in recognition. "Wraith," he whispered. The room stopped breathing. She didn't deny it. He saluted her, not as a general to a civilian, but as a soldier to another soldier who had paid more than most. One by one, the Marines followed. She stood there quiet as always, let it pass through her. She didn't need it, but she accepted it. Later, as she prepared to leave, Diaz thanked her. "Take care of the old ones," she told him. "They remember." Then she was gone. No speech, no ceremony. Just dust settling again. And somewhere behind her, a room full of Marines learned something they wouldn't forget. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did no one notice the way she chose the seat farthest from the screens? The briefing room buzzed with voices and confidence. Pilots leaned back in their chairs, boots hooked around metal rungs, helmets resting casually at their feet like trophies already earned. Technicians crowded near the displays, arguing over specs and schedules, half listening to the lieutenant at the front as if the outcome of the day had already been decided. Our Vance slipped into the room without announcement. She chose the chair no one wanted near the wall, away from the screens, away from the easy sightlines. Not hiding, just observing. It was a habit she had never shaken. Sit where you could see everyone, where no one felt the need to look at you. Her scars were visible today. She hadn't bothered with sleeves. The desert heat made the idea unbearable, and after years of pretending, she no longer felt the need to conceal what the world had already carved into her. Still, she felt the eyes, quick glances, lingering ones, the reflexive discomfort of people who wanted a story but didn't want to hear it. She folded her hands in her lap and listened. The briefing was clean, confident, too clean. They talked about redundancy and safeguards, about hardened links and layered fail-safes. They used words like robust and resilient the way people used them when they hadn't yet been tested. Ara felt the familiar knot tighten low in her stomach, the quiet intuition that came from having watched systems fail when lives depended on them not doing so. She studied the slides instead of the speaker. Tiny inconsistencies jumped out, overlapping dependencies, a confidence built on assumptions instead of verification. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that warning people too early only made them defensive. Sometimes the truth needed to arrive on its own, sharp and undeniable. When the room emptied, the jokes resumed. Consultant didn't say much. Someone muttered as Ara passed behind them. "Probably here to justify a paycheck," another replied. She walked on. Back in the hangar, the noise wrapped around her again, the familiar chaos of movement and metal. She returned to her small desk and opened her laptop, tapping into the secondary streams she'd been quietly granted access to, a courtesy more than a trust. She watched. Patterns emerged, not failures yet, just whispers of them. Across the hangar, the old drone sat unchanged, still grounded, still forgotten. Ara found herself standing beside it again without remembering the decision to walk there. She rested her hand against its patched skin, feeling the unevenness beneath her palm. This machine had survived things the others hadn't, not because it was better, but because it had been forced to adapt. So had she. The memory surfaced uninvited. A different desert, a different sky, the sound of wind cutting through broken concrete instead of open air, her hands shaking as she tried to reroute power through a system never meant to be touched manually. Blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers. The radio crackling with voices that went silent one by one. She pushed the memory down before it could finish forming. Corporal Diaz approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "They're flying the first test run this afternoon," he said. "Full network, real-time integration." She nodded. "I know." He hesitated. "You think it'll hold?" Ara considered the question, considered how honest to be. "It'll fly," she said finally. "Holding is different." Diaz frowned, not reassured. "Should I tell?" "No," she said gently. "Not yet." He studied her face, searching for arrogance, for drama. He found neither, only certainty. That unsettled him more than any warning would have. The first test run went smoothly. Too smoothly. The feeds were crisp, telemetry clean, commands executed without delay. Laughter echoed through the hangar as the drones returned in perfect formation. Ara watched the data lag. By milliseconds no one else noticed. That night she stayed late. The hangar emptied, the noise fading into distant hums and cooling metal. She pulled logs, traced pathways, followed threads that looped back on themselves like a maze designed by someone who expected it to be attacked and expected to win. Her fingers hovered over the keys as realization settled in. It wasn't a flaw. It was bait. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. The old tension returned, sharp and unwelcome, the feeling of standing at the edge of something violent and inevitable. Someone else was watching them. She closed the laptop and stared at the dark screen, her reflection faintly visible beneath the scars. She wondered, not for the first time, whether agreeing to come here had been a mistake, whether stepping back into this world would cost her the fragile peace she had built out of distance and anonymity. Sleep didn't come easily. It never did. The morning of the exercise arrived heavy with heat and expectation. The base buzzed with activity. Vehicles moved with purpose. Radios crackled. Officers smiled too tightly. Ara took her place in the command center, again choosing the spot no one wanted. She watched Colonel Madsen from across the room, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked toward the observation tower where the general would soon stand. Careers were on display today. So were truths. As the countdown began, Ara felt strangely calm. The anxiety receded, replaced by focus. This was familiar ground, this space between confidence and collapse. The drones launched cleanly. The feeds filled the screens with sweeping desert vistas. Applause broke out. Ara didn't join it. Her eyes locked onto a single data stream buried beneath the others. The whisper grew louder. 10 seconds. She leaned forward. 5. Her pulse slowed. Then it hit. The flicker, the code, the cascade. Chaos erupted exactly as she had known it would. Voices rose, commands overlapped, screens went black. Ara stood. She felt the weight of every stare as she moved toward the console, but she didn't look at them. She couldn't afford to. The past pressed close now, not as memory, but as muscle memory, as instinct. When she said she could fix it, the word surprised even her. Not because she doubted herself, but because she had sworn she was done saving systems that didn't bother to save the people inside them. Her hands moved anyway. As the code unfolded beneath her fingers, something else surfaced alongside it: grief. Old, sharp. The faces of people who hadn't gotten a second chance. The cost of being good at this. Of being the one who knew how to hold the line when everything else broke. She finished the fix with a quiet breath. The screens came back. The room froze. Ara felt it then, not triumph, not pride, but a hollow ache where relief should have been. She pushed back from the console and stood, suddenly very tired. As she walked back to her desk, she sensed the shift around her. The way people watched now, carefully, respectfully, as if she were something dangerous that had revealed itself too late to ignore. She sat down and wrapped her hands around her coffee, now cold. The knot in her chest tightened again, because she knew something they didn't. The first attack had been a test, and whoever was watching had just learned exactly how good she still was. Why did the room turn toward her before the alarms even sounded the second time? Ara felt it before she saw it, a subtle shift in the air, not panic this time, anticipation. The command center had learned something in the last hour, and it had changed the way they breathed. The screens were alive again, feeds stable, telemetry flowing as if nothing had happened. But no one trusted it now, not fully. She sat with her shoulders slightly forward, elbows resting on her knees, hands loosely clasped. It was the posture she took when she expected trouble, the posture she had worn in places no one here would ever see on a map. The general stood in the observation tier above, silent, watching. He hadn't spoken since the recovery. Neither had she. Words were unnecessary right now. Systems either held or they didn't. Colonel Madsen cleared his throat and tried to reclaim momentum. Orders were issued. Checklists resumed. Voices steadied themselves with procedure. Ara watched the spectrum display instead. It started as noise, harmless-looking interference bleeding across unused bands, the kind of thing junior analysts filtered out without a second glance. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Not noise. Movement. Her jaw tightened. She recognized the pattern the way you recognize a familiar gait in a crowd. The rhythm wasn't random. It was aggressive, probing, testing edges. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Respect. They're not done, she said quietly. The words weren't meant for the room, but they carried anyway. Lieutenant Jesperson turned toward her, already pale, already listening now in a way he hadn't before. Explain, he said. Ara straightened slowly. The first hit was digital. That was to see how fast you'd react. This, she nodded toward the spectrum display, is physical, electronic warfare. They're flooding the air, not the network. Madsen's voice came sharp through the comms. Are we jammed? Not yet, Ara replied. They're hurting you, forcing your systems to chase ghosts. As if on cue, the feeds began to stutter. Not blackouts this time, something worse. Delay, drift, commands executing a half-second late, images tearing at the edges. The pilot swore softly. Countermeasures, Madsen demanded. They won't work, Ara said. Too slow, too clean. The room went still again. She felt it then, the familiar weight of decision pressing down on her chest. The moment where observation ended and commitment began. She had spent years avoiding this feeling, telling herself she was done being the one who stepped forward when everything went wrong. But the world had a way of ignoring such promises. They're using an old protocol, she continued. Frequency hopping, brutal, effective. They don't care if they disrupt themselves as long as you go blind. Silence. In the observation tier, the general leaned forward slightly. Name it, he said. Ara hesitated. She hadn't planned to say it out loud. Names carried power, memory, consequence. Wolfhound, she said finally. The word landed like a dropped tool. Jesperson blinked. That's obsolete. Obsolete doesn't mean forgotten, Ara replied. It means no one's ready for it. Her gaze shifted instinctively toward the far end of the hangar where the old drone sat dormant. The ghost, analog, shielded, unimpressive by modern standards. Untouchable by this kind of attack. Her heart beat a little faster now. Not fear, recognition, the sense of pieces aligning whether she wanted them to or not. Bring the ghost online, she said. The reaction was immediate. That thing hasn't flown in months. It's analog. It's grounded for a reason. Ara turned fully toward them then. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. That reason is exactly why it'll work. Madsen hesitated, the kind of hesitation that came from standing at the edge of professional ruin. Then he exhaled sharply. Do it. The hangar exploded into motion. Technicians ran. Cables were dragged. Power surged through systems that hadn't felt it in a long time. Warnings screamed on displays as the old drone woke reluctantly, like something pulled from deep sleep. Ara moved with them now, no longer the observer. She stood beside the young pilot assigned to the Ghost, a lieutenant whose hands trembled as he strapped in. "Look at me," she said softly. He did. "Forget the screen," she continued. "It doesn't know this aircraft. Watch the gauges. Listen to the vibration. Feel the lift." He swallowed. "You've flown it." She paused. "Not like this," she said, "but I know it." The engines roared unevenly, then settled. The Ghost taxied forward, awkward but steady. The jamming intensified. "Signals degrading," someone shouted. Ara leaned closer to the pilot. "Trust it," she said. "They can't touch you." The Ghost lifted off. The room held its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the spectrum display shifted. A clear line cut through the noise, sharp and unmistakable. The Ghost's analog signal punched through the interference like a blade. The rest of the network latched onto it instinctively, rerouting through a pathway no one had designed, but one that had always existed. Feed stabilized. The pilots exhaled as one. The exercise resumed, transformed. The opposing force adapted, then faltered. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't planned for a relic to become the spine of the system. Ara watched the data with a distant calm. The victory didn't thrill her. It saddened her. Because she knew exactly what kind of enemy thought this way. The kind that learned. The kind that remembered. When the exercise ended, applause filled the room. Someone laughed, a sound edged with disbelief. Madsen let out a breath he'd been holding all day. Ara stepped back, suddenly feeling out of place again. She caught her reflection in a darkened screen, the scars, the tired eyes, the woman she had become after everything she had survived. She wondered briefly if this was how it started again. Recognition, reliance, the slow erosion of the quiet life she had built. The general descended from the observation tier. The room straightened automatically, but he waved off formalities. His attention wasn't on Madsen or the screens. It was on her. Ara felt his gaze settle on her forearms, on the way the scars caught the light. She resisted the urge to cover them, had learned long ago that hiding only gave them more power. He stepped closer. Up close he looked older than she'd expected, the kind of age earned, not counted. His eyes were sharp, but there was something else there now, recognition blooming into something heavier. He extended a hand. Then he froze. His eyes dropped to her wrist. To the tattoo. The raven feather. Ara felt the moment land like a physical weight. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She hadn't thought about that symbol in years, had almost forgotten what it meant to people who knew how to read it. The general's hand lowered slowly. "Impossible," he murmured. The word wasn't denial. It was awe. He looked up at her face now, really looked. At the scar through her eyebrow, at the stillness in her posture, at the calm that came from having already lost everything once. "Wraith," he said. The room went silent. Ara closed her eyes for half a second. So it had finally caught up to her. She opened them again and met his gaze. He straightened, shoulders squaring not with authority but with respect. He raised his hand in a sharp, precise salute. Not for the consultant. For the soldier everyone believed was dead. The shock rippled outward. Madsen snapped to attention, shame flickering across his face before discipline masked it. Others followed without being told. Boots clicked. Spines straightened. Ara stood in the center of it, unmoving. She didn't return the salute immediately. She thought of the ones who should have been standing here instead, the ones who never got to walk away, the ones whose names were buried under classification and silence. Then she lifted her hand. A simple, clean motion. Enough. When the moment passed, she felt emptied, as if the past had finally closed its fingers around her again, not in anger but in acknowledgement. Later, as she stood beside the ghost one last time, Corporal Diaz approached. His eyes held none of the curiosity they once had, only understanding. "Thank you," he said. Ara nodded. "Learn from it," she replied. "Don't wait for things to break before you listen." She turned away before he could ask more. As she walked toward the transport vehicle waiting at the edge of the hangar, she felt the old weight settle into place. The knowledge that no matter how far she ran, the things she was good at would always find her again. The door closed behind her. The dust rose. And somewhere inside the base, systems hummed stronger than before, not because they were newer, but because someone had remembered why the old ways still mattered. Sometimes survival isn't about being the fastest or the smartest. Sometimes it's about knowing what still works when everything else fails. Why did the silence after the salutes feel heavier than the chaos that came before? Ara felt it as she walked away from the command center, not relief, not pride, but a tightening sense of exposure. Recognition had a weight to it, heavier than anonymity, heavier than judgment. For years she had learned how to live unnoticed, how to let the world assume she was smaller, weaker, irrelevant. It had been a shield, a fragile one, but hers. Now it had been stripped away with a single word. Wraith. The hangar felt different as she passed through it. The same space, the same metal and concrete and oil-stained floors, but the eyes that followed her no longer carried humor or dismissal. They carried caution, curiosity, respect that hadn't been earned through rank but through something far less comfortable. She hated that kind of respect. It asked questions she didn't want to answer. She stopped beside the ghost again, resting her hand against its fuselage. The drone still hummed softly, cooling after flight, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. She could feel the vibration through her palm, steady and familiar. "You did good," she murmured, unsure whether she was speaking to the machine or herself. Her reflection stared back at her from the dull composite surface. The scars caught the light. They always did. She remembered when they had been new, when every one of them had burned like an accusation. That night sleep came in fragments. She dreamed in static and shadow, of rooftops and narrow stairwells, of voices calling call signs that no longer existed, of her own breathing, too loud in her ears as she waited for the signal that never came. She woke before dawn, heart racing, hand clenched as if around a weapon that wasn't there. The base was quiet at that hour. The desert beyond the perimeter fence stretched endlessly, indifferent to what humans built within it. Ara walked slowly, letting the cool air steady her. She had learned to ground herself like this. One step, one breath, one moment at a time. By mid-morning, the whispers had started. They followed her through corridors and across the tarmac, hushed but relentless. She didn't need to hear the words to know their shape. Legends never stayed contained once spoken aloud. They leaked. They grew. They became something else entirely. Colonel Madsen requested her presence just before noon. His office looked the same as before, immaculate, controlled, every object in its place. But the man behind the desk was different. The rigid certainty had cracked, replaced by something closer to humility, or fear. She wasn't sure which. He didn't ask her to sit. Instead, he stood when she entered. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words clearly practiced but no less difficult for it. "For my assumptions." Ara studied him for a moment. She felt no anger, no satisfaction, only a quiet tiredness. "Assumptions are efficient," she said. "They save time." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing the rebuke. General Thorne has revised your status." She almost smiled, almost. "I expected as much," she replied. Madsen hesitated. "You could stay," he said. "Officially, we could." "No," she interrupted gently, not unkindly, just firm. He searched her face, perhaps looking for ambition, for resentment, for leverage. He found none. "You don't want command," he said, surprised. "I've had it," Ara replied. "I know what it costs." The words lingered between them. Outside, the day pressed on. The base returned to its rhythm, but a subtle shift remained. Procedures were followed more carefully now. Older systems reevaluated. Voices listened to that hadn't been before. Change rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived in small decisions, in pauses where arrogance once lived. Ara spent the afternoon packing her few belongings. The worn duffel swallowed them easily. She paused once, holding the laptop in her hands, thought about wiping it completely. She didn't. Some things were meant to remain intact. As evening approached, she returned to the hangar one last time. The Ghost sat where it always had, but now technicians moved around it with care. Respect. Someone had cleaned the dust from its wings. Corporal Diaz stood nearby, watching her approach. He straightened instinctively, then caught himself. "You don't have to," he began. She shook her head. "I know." He hesitated, then asked the question he'd been carrying since the salutes. "Were you really dead?" Ara considered him, his youth, his sincerity, the way he still believed the world followed clean lines. "I was declared dead," she said. "That's not the same thing." "What happened?" he asked quietly. She looked past him, toward the open hangar doors and the desert beyond. "Things went wrong," she said. "They usually do." He nodded, understanding more from her restraint than he would have from any story. When the transport arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Ara slung her duffel over her shoulder and walked toward it without ceremony. The general was waiting. Not in uniform this time. No entourage. Just a man standing alone, hands clasped behind his back. "I won't pretend I understand what you went through," he said as she approached, "but I recognize what it took to survive it." She met his gaze. "Survival isn't the hard part," she replied. "Living afterward is." He nodded. "If you ever choose to come back." "I won't," she said gently. A pause. But she continued, "Someone else might make room for them." The general smiled faintly. "We'll try." She climbed into the vehicle and closed the door. The engine started. The base began to recede. As the gates opened and the desert swallowed the road ahead, Ara leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. The scars on her arms caught the fading light one last time before shadow claimed them. She felt no triumph, no closure. Only a quiet certainty. She had done what needed to be done. Not to be seen, not to be honored, but because when systems failed and people panicked, she still knew how to stand steady. And maybe that was enough. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive as forgiveness. Sometimes it arrives as the simple knowledge that, when it mattered, you didn't turn away. Why did the road feel longer now that she was finally leaving? The transport rolled through the gate and onto the open stretch of desert highway, tires humming against sun-warmed asphalt. Ara watched the base shrink in the side mirror until it became just another cluster of shapes swallowed by heat haze. For a while, she said nothing. Silence had always been easier when movement was involved. Motion gave it purpose. The driver didn't ask questions. He'd been briefed not to. That alone told her how deeply the morning had rippled through the chain of command. She rested her forearms on her knees, fingers loosely interlaced. The scars were quiet today. No itching, no phantom burn. That happened sometimes after closure if such a thing existed, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. She thought about the salute again. Not the shock of it, not the room snapping to attention. the hesitation before she returned it. That half-second where the past had risen up in front of her like a wall, faces, voices, call signs spoken for the last time, the unbearable weight of knowing she had lived when others hadn't. Survivor's guilt was an ugly phrase, too small, too clinical. It wasn't guilt that haunted her. It was responsibility. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, then looked away quickly. Even now, people weren't sure how to look at her. That part hadn't changed. What had changed was what they thought they saw. She preferred before. The transport hit a small bump, jarring her back into the present. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing in time with the road. Long inhales, controlled exhales, techniques learned in places where panic meant death. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. She ignored it. Whatever it was could wait. If it couldn't, someone else would handle it. That was the rule she'd set for herself years ago, a hard rule, a necessary one. When the vehicle finally stopped at the small civilian airstrip, the sun was dipping low, staining the horizon red and gold. Ara stepped out and slung her duffel over her shoulder. The air felt different here, less rigid, less watchful. She walked toward the terminal slowly, then paused. Something tugged at her awareness. Not danger, not threat. Recognition. She turned. Colonel Madsen stood a short distance away, alone, hands clasped behind his back in an almost unconscious imitation of the general's posture. He looked uncomfortable, out of place without walls and authority around him. "I didn't think you'd come," Ara said. "I wasn't sure I should," he admitted, "but I needed to say this without an audience." She waited. "I built my career on systems," he continued. "Rules, structure, predictability. I believed that if you followed them closely enough, nothing important slipped through." Ara tilted her head slightly, listening. "You didn't fit," he said, "so I dismissed you." She didn't argue. "That kind of thinking," he went on, voice tight, "gets people killed." It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a defense. It was a confession. Ara nodded once. "It can," she agreed. He swallowed. "I won't make that mistake again." She studied him for a moment, searching for ego, for self-preservation. She found only resolve, tempered by shame. "Good," she said, "because next time you might not get a second chance." He straightened instinctively, then stopped himself. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you did and for what you didn't." She understood. He meant the exposure she hadn't forced, the authority she hadn't claimed, the wreckage she'd chosen not to leave behind. She gave him a small nod and turned away. Inside the terminal, the air conditioning hummed softly. Normal people moved through normal routines. Coffee cups, rolling luggage, mundane conversations about weather and delays. Ara felt like a ghost walking through it all. At the gate, she finally checked her phone. One missed call. One message. She stared at the number for a long moment. Then she exhaled slowly and opened it. He knows now, so do others. It won't stay quiet. She closed her eyes. Of course it wouldn't. Legends never stayed buried once they were named. Someone always dug. Someone always remembered a detail that didn't quite fit. A report that never closed cleanly. A body that was never found. She typed a single reply. "I figured." A pause. Then another message. "If you need extraction, say the word." Ara smiled faintly. Some things never changed. "Not yet," she replied, "but stay close." She boarded the plane without ceremony and took a window seat. As the engine spooled up, she felt the familiar vibration settle into her bones. Aircraft had always been honest with her. They either flew or they didn't. No pretense, no ego. As the plane lifted off, the desert unfolded beneath her, vast and indifferent. She watched the ground recede until details blurred into patterns. Her thoughts drifted backward again, this time not to the worst moment, but to the one before it all went wrong. A briefing room much like the one she just left. A younger version of herself, still believing that competence could shield everyone. That preparation was enough. She had learned otherwise. The lesson had cost her everything. Her fingers brushed the raven feather tattoo absently. The ink was faded now, edges softened by time and scar tissue. It had never been meant to last. None of it had. The plane leveled out. She closed her eyes and let the hum lull her into a half-sleep, the kind that hovered just above dreams. Images flickered at the edges of her mind, not nightmares this time, but fragments. The ghost lifting into the air, Diaz's careful attention as he worked, the way the room had gone silent when the general recognized her. She wondered what those Marines would remember most. The scars, the legend, or the quiet way she'd fixed what was broken and walked away. Hours later, the plane touched down in a city that didn't know her name. That anonymity felt like a balm. She stepped into the terminal and blended into the crowd without effort. Outside, night had fallen. Neon lights reflected off wet pavement. The world moved on, oblivious to what had almost happened in the desert. Ara hailed a cab and gave an address she knew by heart. As the city rolled past, she felt the edges of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Not the loud kind. Not the kind built on promises or redemption arcs. The quiet kind. The kind that whispered, "You're still here." She didn't know how long that would last. Didn't fool herself into believing the past would let her go easily. But for tonight, for this stretch of road and this anonymous city, she allowed herself to breathe. Because strength, she had learned, wasn't always about standing firm under fire. Sometimes it was about knowing when to step away, and trusting that the world would keep turning without you holding it together. Why did the quiet feel more dangerous than the battlefield ever had? Ara woke before dawn, the city still wrapped in that fragile hour where night hadn't fully surrendered. Rain tapped lightly against the window of her small apartment, each drop steady, predictable. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm. Cities had a heartbeat too. You just had to slow down enough to hear it. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory settled back in the hangar, the salutes, the name spoken aloud after years of silence. Wraith. She exhaled and sat up, running a hand through her hair. Her body felt heavier than it had in weeks, as if the past had finally caught up and demanded to be carried again. She brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching headlights smear into lines of white and red below. Somewhere out there, people were beginning ordinary days. They had no idea how close a system had come to collapsing. No idea how often it did, held together by people whose names would never make it into headlines. She preferred it that way. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't ignore it. The message was short. "They're asking questions, quietly, not hostile yet." Ara stared at the screen. This was the part she'd been waiting for without wanting to admit it. Recognition never ended with a salute. It ended with curiosity, and curiosity in the wrong hands became leverage. She typed back slowly. "I won't disappear again." A pause. "That wasn't what I meant," the reply came. "You don't owe anyone anything." She smiled faintly. Maybe once that would have been true, but the world had changed, and so had she. After breakfast, she walked the neighborhood. No weapon, no mission clock, just her and the wet pavement and the hum of traffic. She passed people walking dogs, opening shops, living lives untouched by call signs and contingency plans. It grounded her. At a small park, she sat on a bench and watched a woman teach a child how to ride a bike. The kid wobbled, panicked, almost fell, then steadied, laughed, pedaled forward on their own. Ara felt something tighten in her chest. Letting go had always been the hardest part. By afternoon, the questions had reached her directly. A call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was measured, careful, someone trained to sound harmless. "We'd like to talk," the voice said. "No uniforms, no records." Ara closed her eyes. "I figured," she replied. A pause, respectful. "We won't ask you to come back." She almost laughed. "You already are," she said. "You just haven't said it yet." Silence followed, then a soft acknowledgement, not denial. They met at dusk, in a place that didn't belong to anyone, a quiet overlook above the city, lights beginning to flicker on below. The man who waited there was older than she'd expected, not military anymore, if he ever had been. He didn't offer his name. She didn't offer hers. "We're not here to reactivate you," he said carefully. "We're here because the world is fragile." Ara leaned against the railing, watching the city breathe beneath them. "It always is," she replied. He nodded. "And people like you are rare." She turned to face him then, her expression unreadable. "People like me break," she said. "You just don't see it on paper." He didn't argue. "That's why we're asking, not ordering." Asking. The word mattered. She thought of the ghost, of Daya's learning to listen instead of assume, of Madsen unlearning certainty, of the general's salute not to power but to endurance. "I won't be what I was," she said slowly. "Not again." "We don't want that," the man replied. "We want what you became afterward." Ara considered that. The years spent rebuilding herself from pieces no one else saw, the patience, the restraint, the refusal to be defined by violence alone. "Then here's my answer," she said. "I won't lead missions, I won't hunt, I won't disappear into shadows." He waited. "I'll teach," she continued, quietly, systems, failure points, how to listen when something doesn't feel right, and when to step back before it breaks you. The man smiled, not triumphantly but with relief. "That might be exactly what we need." Night settled fully around them. As they parted, Ara felt lighter than she had in years. Not because the world was suddenly safer, but because she had finally drawn a line that honored who she had become, not just who she had been. Days turned into weeks. Ara's life took on a new rhythm. She consulted quietly, advised from the margins, spoke rarely but with weight. She taught people to question clean answers, to respect old systems, to understand that resilience wasn't always about advancement, sometimes it was about remembering. She never wore a uniform again. She never used the call sign. But sometimes, when a system held under pressure, or a young analyst paused instead of panicking, she felt that same quiet satisfaction she'd once felt after a mission done right. Not victory. Alignment. One evening, as she walked home under a sky washed clean by rain, her phone buzzed with a familiar name. Daya's. She smiled and answered. "We fixed it," he said, excitement barely contained. "The ghost, we rebuilt the logic around it. The whole squadron's stronger now." "I knew you would," Ara replied. There was a pause. "They talk about you sometimes," he added, "not like a legend, like a lesson." Her smile softened. "That's better," she said. She ended the call and continued walking, the city lights reflecting off her scars as they always had. They no longer felt like markers of what she'd lost. They felt like proof of what she'd survived. Ara stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the light to change. Around her, strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, unaware of the quiet strength among them. That was how it should be. When the light turned green, she stepped forward with the crowd, just another person moving through the world. No salutes. No whispers. Just purpose. Because she had learned something the hard way, something that no rank or legend could teach. Strength doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. And it doesn't need to be remembered to matter. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.